There you go. Okay, so hi everybody, welcome back. This is, I think, like our fifth Who's Who class, so we're plugging right along. Last week we took a look at Rabban Gamliel, who was a Tannahitic sage and the first individual to serve as the Nasi of the Sanhedrin after it was sort of reformulated or reconstituted in Yavne after the destruction of the Second Temple. At this point, we're going to be taking kind of a look at a series of rabbis, all of whom are united by being contemporaries of Rabban Gamliel, and all of whom are important students of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Yochanan ben Zakkai, as you may recall, was the rabbi who had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem when the Great Revolt was happening. That Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans. He went to the Roman general Vespasian and made the request to be granted the right to set up a rabbinic academy in Yavne. And that rabbinic academy became the sort of nexus for the early rabbinic movement. The several generations of sages who lived after the destruction of the Second Temple that we call the Tannaim. Otherwise, we can think of those folks as the sages whose voices and opinions make it into the Mishnah, as distinguished from the Amoraim, who are the sages who are known for being in the Gemara, who come after who are commenting upon the Mishnah. Okay, so Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai has 5 principal students. There's actually a passage on this subject in Pirkei Avot. So I thought we could kind of kick this off by taking a look at that passage. It's interesting. It mentions the 5 students and also kind of gives a quick sort of description of that individual of those people by Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai himself. So we'll take a look at that real quick. So for this, I am going to be sharing a PDF of the readings that I've assembled for this particular class. So you can grab the PDF in the chat window there and open it up that way if you want. I'm also going to share the screen here for folks who don't want to do that, don't have that option, and for folks watching on the video. So I'm sharing here. Yeah. Just a second. I'm going to just do one thing here and just check to make sure. Oh, no, wait. Okay. And I'm pinning myself. Thanks. Yeah. All right. So sharing the screen. All right. Can I get someone to unmute and volunteer to read us this first reading? This is from Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah number 8, concerning Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's 5 famous students. All right, Ross.
I'll do it.
Thanks, Greg.
Okay. Rabban Yohan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, and they were these: Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos, Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Jose the priest, Rabbi Shimon ben Nathaniel, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. He, Rabbi Yohanan, used to list their outstanding virtues. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos is a plastered cistern which loses not a drop. Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, happy is the woman that gave birth to him. Rabbi Jose the priest is a pious man. Rabbi Simeon ben Nathaniel is one that fears sin, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach is like a spring that gathers force. He used to say, if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of the balance, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos on the other scale, he would outweigh them all. Abba Shaul said in his name, if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of the balance, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos also with them, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach on the other scale, he would outweigh them all. Pirkei Avot 2:8.
All right, thank you. Okay, so a couple things about this, right? All of these individuals who studied with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai are significant in that they are, important sages of the Mishnah. In particular, today, we're going to be looking at the first individual on that list, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos, of whom Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that he's like the way it's translated here, he's like a plastered cistern that loses not a drop. I don't know, anyone want to take a stab at what he means by that or what that might indicate about him as a person? Sharon.
I see two things.
Mhm.
One, that he just absorbs information and knowledge and keeps it, doesn't forget it, keeps it, so I presumably to pass on.
Mhm.
And the other would be, it might be even personal, that you could tell him anything and he would keep it to himself. He's maybe a very, very honest person.
Could be, yeah. But yeah, certainly this element of memory and retention is part of this image, and that's pretty much the case for Rabbi Eliezer. He's an extremely important figure in the Mishnah. He's one of the most frequently quoted rabbis of the Tannaitic period. There are over 300 halachot, 300 distinct halakhic opinions that are attributed to him in the Mishnah. And there are nearly that same number of additional quotations of him in Baraitot, which are rabbinic teachings from the Tannaitic period that don't appear in the Mishnah. When Rabbi Judah Hanazi compiles the Mishnah in the year 200 CE, he doesn't, a great deal of rabbinic teaching goes into the written document of the Mishnah, but there's a good deal of rabbinic teaching that doesn't make it into the document. Those additional Tannaitic teachings that don't appear in the Mishnah are referred to as baraitot, as a baraita, which literally means something which is outside, right? In other words, teachings from outside of the Mishnah. And the reason that we still have these, right, given that they didn't make it into the Mishnah, is that they were preserved and transmitted orally, and that they get mentioned later on in the Gemara, right? So there's a great number of baraitot, of outside teachings that are mentioned in the Talmud that don't actually appear in the Mishnah, and they're frequently brought in order to settle some dispute or bring an alternate teaching on a particular subject that isn't mentioned than the one that's presented in the Mishnah. Sharon, you got a hand up?
Yeah. Does a baraita have the same authority as a halacha?
Yes, a baraita and a Mishnah occupy about the same level of authority.
Okay.
The degree of authority of a particular Mishnah or baraita has less to do, as understood in the sort of the halachic process as it develops later, is more to do with the individual in question who is being quoted than with the source of that teaching, right? By and large, the Baraitot that are brought within the Gemara are understood to be true and credible and authentic teachings of the rabbis in question. And so the question of which Tannaitic teaching has precedence over another has more to do with the sage who's teaching it than it does to do with the source of it, whether it's being brought in the Mishnah or whether it's coming from a Baraita, from an external source.
Okay.
All right, so Eliezer ben Horkenos. I'm going to start here by mentioning a couple of things about his origins. The story, like many of the sages of this generation, he's got a story about where he came from, right? And the story that they tell about Rabbi Eliezer, he's Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos. In general, in the Mishnah, he tends to be referred to pretty much exclusively as Rabbi Eliezer. Among the Tannaim, there's generally one sage who gets to be known by his actual name, and then all other sages who share that name are referred to by a patronym, by who they're the son of, or by some characteristic or attribute of that individual, right? In other words, there are several Rabbi Eliezers. There's only one Rabbi Eliezer who's referred to as Rabbi Eliezer without some qualifier, and that's this Rabbi Eliezer, who happens to also be Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenos. So the story they tell about Rabbi Eliezer is that he got into Torah relatively late in his life. Until the age of 28, he worked on his father's estate. His father was a wealthy man, owned a lot of land. Rabbi Eliezer was working for him. One day, Rabbi Eliezer decided that he wanted to begin studying Torah, but his father laughed at the idea and told him that 28 was too old to begin, and recommended that he get married instead and send his children to school. Disappointed, Eliezer cried frequently until the prophet Elijah came and appeared to him and told him to go to Jerusalem to study with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he went to Jerusalem and he became one of that rabbi's students, and he was dedicated. He studied very hard. Because he had left home without any money, he didn't have anything to eat. There's a story that Rabbi Yochanan noticed a bad smell on his breath and sent Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Yosei HaKohen, Rabbi Yosei the priest that we mentioned before, to go find out what was going on. They found out that Rabbi Eliezer was so poor that he was basically eating dirt. And so Rabbi Yochanan arranged to have him provided with proper food. Some of you will note by this point that we are starting to see what might be called a genre of rabbinic origin stories. And that oftentimes these rabbinic origin stories tend to focus on the great lengths that future rabbi went to in order to be able to study Torah. Rabbi Hillel had his own origin story of a similar kind, right? Where he, didn't have enough money to one day to pay the guard, the shomer of the Beit Midrash, and so he snuck up onto the roof to listen in at the window and got covered by like several feet of snow. Right? There's a number of these stories, and the sort of general theme of all of these rabbinic origin stories oftentimes is that how dedicated this individual was to studying Torah and how much hardship and difficulty they had to go through in order to be able to study, right? This is a positive value for the rabbis, and so it's a kind of a popular theme in the legendary that builds up around the these rabbinic figures. Dan.
What, me?
Yeah.
I thought Jerusalem was totally in ruins and had been essentially plowed over. You said they studied in Jerusalem.
Not yet. This is before the destruction.
Oh.
Yeah. Craig.
Well, I had a similar question. Yohanan ben Zakkai was the Jew, allowed to create this academy by the Romans after the destruction of the temple. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So was he, I mean, I hate to use the word, not a collaborator, but did he have to kind of use the pro-Roman, we're not going to go form another temple kind of narrative and more kind of push the whole rabbinic Judaism push? Was that his kind of legacy a little bit, or?
Yeah, so for the whole story on this, I'm actually going to encourage you to go back and take a look at the video on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of our class on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. But to do a very long story short, one of the things that may be significant in coming up as we kind of examine the lives and historic legacies of these rabbis from the early Tannaitic period is that the whole, the question of the Romans versus the Jews, right, which is the kind of story that we generally kind of talk about this period, is a little bit simplistic, a little bit oversimplified. So the Great Revolt that occurred, that was the precipitating factor that eventually led to the destruction of the Second Temple, was a politically complicated event. It was launched by a political/social faction of the Jews that are generally referred to as the Zealots or the Kanaim, the jealous ones, right? Who were trying to launch a military revolt to expel the Romans. After their rebellion in the Galilee failed, the surviving Zealots fled to Jerusalem and basically took over the city, and continued their revolt, trying to expel the Romans. The Romans besieged the Jerusalem, and eventually the city was destroyed. The thing with the Zealots is that the Zealots were they were precisely that. They were Zealots. They were a politically violent faction who were not at all above killing their political opponents, their Jewish political opponents, in order to get their way. So at the period of time in which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had himself smuggled out of the city, the reason he had to have himself smuggled out of the city was because the Zealots were going around killing anyone who was not sufficiently dedicated to the cause. And there was no way for anyone to get out of the city except unless they were dead. That's why he had to pretend he was dead in order to be smuggled out of the city, right? The sages in Yavna, the early kind of rabbinic academy that was established there after the destruction of the temple, they had the Roman government's approval to be there. And the Nasi, the patriarch or president of the Sanhedrin, that was established, that had been in Jerusalem but was reestablished in Yavna, had a certain amount of semi-official recognition from the Roman government, right? That doesn't mean that the Romans were not persecuting Jews at various times during this period. It's a politically complicated time. And it's also a situation where the rabbis are one faction among a number of different Jewish factions which existed at the time, many of whom simply did not survive the Roman reprisals against the rebellion, right? The last of the Zealots end up fleeing Jerusalem when it gets recaptured, making a last stand at Masada, and then killing themselves and their wives and children when it became evident that they weren't going to be, able to succeed. And that was the end of the Zealots as a political faction. The rabbis very much did not look on the Zealots as in positive terms. Let's just leave it at that. Anyway, all of this is to say, it's useful to remember that the early generation of rabbinic sages, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students, and that whole generation of rabbinic sages, all of these folks still at this point had been alive before the destruction. All of these people, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabban Gamliel, all of these early Tannaim had been alive and were part of the pre-rabbinic Pharisaic community before the destruction of the temple, and then went to Yavne to become part of that community as it was developing under Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai after the destruction of the temple. It's going to maybe be an interesting thing to pay attention to as we move along. When exactly we hit that cutoff point where we start seeing rabbis who were not alive at that time and who had never seen the temple, right? But right at the moment, all of these rabbis were alive at that time. They had seen the temple, and they are now in the process of building and consolidating, right? So, so yeah, these are all, in other words, all of these are good questions. It's important it's an important point to make that none of these figures that we're talking about yet are completely post-temple. All of them were alive and studying Torah before the temple was destroyed. We will eventually get to a generation of Tannaim who never got to see the temple, right? Who grew up as the students of those rabbis who founded the academy at Yavne. Interestingly, this division between Eliezer and his father, right? He wanted to go study his Torah. His father was not into it. That friction continues as he remains in Jerusalem studying the Torah. The story goes on to say that his father made a journey to Jerusalem to swear the oath that was necessary in order to disinherit Rabbi Eliezer and make him sure that he didn't inherit any of Horkenos's, property when he died. But when Horkenos entered the Beit Midrash, he saw his son sitting at the head of the class, and Rabbi Yochanan was praising his exposition of the Torah, and apparently he had a change of heart, so he decided he wanted to bequeath his entire fortune to Eliezer. The story says that Eliezer refused to accept more than his brothers got, so that's kind of how it goes. The reason I think that's actually important and interesting is this, that we've talked a few times in previous classes about this question about how authoritative were the rabbis, right? The rabbis see themselves as leaders. To what extent are other Jews recognizing them as leaders? One of the underlying kind of presuppositions of a lot of these stories of rabbinic struggle in order to be able to study Torah, one of the underlying issues here is that being a rabbi does not necessarily carry this kind of social and cultural weight at this time that it did later on in Jewish history, right? The rabbis are still a fairly new group, and they're only one group among many. And especially in the period of the Tannaim, in a lot of these stories, there's a certain implicit understanding of controversy or friction between the rabbis. In other words, the keepers of the authoritative Torah as they understood it, and the entire rest of the Jews who did not understand the Torah in the same way that the rabbis did. The rabbis had a term for those Jews. It was Am Haaretz, which literally means people of the land. And for the rabbis, that term, Am Haaretz, basically ends up meaning something like ignoramus or ignorant person, right? Because for the rabbis, the vast majority of Jews who did not study in the rabbinic academies and were not educated in the ways of the oral as well as the written Torah were completely ignorant of the real fundamental underpinnings of Judaism, and they didn't understand anything about Judaism. The rabbis clearly wanted to become authoritative leaders of the Jewish people as a whole, but it took a while for them to develop that kind of cultural cachet. They started off as a fairly select elite group that was pretty much defined by people who had studied, in the rabbinic academies. And this also has an important role to play in sort of the social aspects of the early rabbinic movement, in that there's a lot of intermarriage among the families of the rabbis, right? They prefer to marry among themselves and not outside of their group among the Am Haaretz. This is the case for Rabbi Eliezer. His wife is a woman named Ima Shalom. Literally, her name means mother of peace. and she was Rabban Gamliel's sister. So that kind of is an illustration of the extent to which there's a lot of intermarriage going on among the different families of rabbis, because they kind of start with their own group, right? And regard it as preferable to marry within a rabbinic family than to take a spouse from outside of that group, among people who are not familiar with Jewish law as the rabbis understand it. Over time, the rabbis rise to higher and higher status and develop, and the Jewish world as a whole starts to take on the rabbinic understanding of mitzvah and halachah. But that's something that's a process. It takes time. And at least at this particular point, the rabbis don't have that kind of reach. It's a much more limited group than we might imagine. When we're used to thinking, for example, of the Jewish community in the Middle Ages, which was basically completely rabbinic through and through. All right, so thus far, Rabbi Eliezer's origins. We mentioned the Great Revolt. During the Roman siege of Jerusalem, in fact, it is Rabbi Eliezer, along with Rabbi Yochanan's other main student, Rabbi Yehoshua, who smuggle Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai out of the city in a coffin. So that may give you an indication of how important Rabbi Eliezer is in this sort of early rabbinic movement. After the Khorban, the destruction of the Second Temple, he becomes an important scholar in Yavna. At some point, he lives in the town of Lod, where he owned a vineyard, presumably inherited from his father. And it's said that his Beit Din, his rabbinic court in Lod, was widely known for maintaining a very high standard of justice. There are several rabbinic statements concerning like the justice and uprightness of courts that essentially say, if you want to see a court operating according to strict standards of justice and uprightness and righteousness, then go check out Rabbi Eliezer's court in Lod. He's a model example of how to run a Beit Din that the rabbis would sometimes point to. Okay. So I want to take a second a little bit to talk about what makes Rabbi Eliezer him, like what's particular about Rabbi Eliezer among the rabbis, because part of what we're doing with this class is I want to give people a sense for like these rabbis are different individuals. They have their own approaches, they have their own personalities, and they have their own issues, right? When we talk about the rabbis as a group, I mean, there's accuracy to that because the rabbis share many things in common, many ideas and values in common, but they are all individuals, and each of them has their own particular attitude or approach that's significant. So specifically with Rabbi Eliezer, in his case, his halakhic approach, as we can kind of discern it among all the many, many halachot that are attributed to his name, seems to have been quite conservative in nature. There are a number of recorded statements from Rabbi Eliezer that seem to indicate that he had a distaste for any attempt to base halachah on logical inference or interpretation, as opposed to received tradition. So for an illustration of what I'm talking about here, I'm going to share another piece of text with you all. Before I go over to the text, can I get a volunteer for who's going to read this particular one? All right, Sharon, you got it. I'm going to share the screen again. And this is the second reading. This one's out of the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sukkah, 28, side A. Take it away, Sharon.
The sages taught. There was an incident involving Rabbi Eliezer, who stayed in the Upper Galilee, and the people there asked him 30 halachot in the halachot of Sukkah. And in response to 12, he said to them, I heard an answer from my teachers, and he related what he heard. In response to the other 18, he said to them, I did not hear an answer. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, said, It was the reverse of these matters. In response to 18, he said to them, I heard an answer. In response to the other 12, he said to them, I did not hear an answer. They said to him, are all the matters that you know only from what you heard? That is, don't you say any matters on your own? He said to them, do you want me to say a matter that I did not hear from my teachers? In all my days, no person ever preceded me into the study hall, and I never slept in the study hall, neither substantial sleep or a brief nap. And I never left anyone in the study hall when I left, and I never engaged in idle chatter, and I never taught anything that I did not hear from my teacher before me.
So before we launch into any other part of this, one thing I want to briefly draw attention to is this: there's something happening in this statement, in this teaching, that was also happening in the previous teaching we looked at from Pirkei Avot, that I'm sure you noticed, which is in both cases, we've got some amount of disagreement as to how the story actually goes, right? In the previous one, there's some disagreement over whether it was Rabbi Eliezer, who could be weighed against all the other rabbis, or whether it was Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach, right? There's Abba Shaul heard it differently, right? Same thing here, right? Where there's some question as to whether it was in fact 18 that he had not heard and 12 that he had heard, or whether it was the other way around, that he had heard 18 pieces of halachah and he hadn't heard anything about the other 12 questions, right? In this case, it's Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Yehuda, who's got a different version. This is pretty common in the rabbinic literature, and it's indicative of something that we find in an oral tradition, right? Which is not everybody heard the story exactly the same. That kind of, this is the story we're telling, but so-and-so heard it differently, is very, very common. And it's one of the most frequent reasons for argument and debate in the Gemara over what the halachah actually is, right? Especially when I heard the halachah is this way, according to this rabbi. I heard the rabbi said it this other way. And then there's a debate, right? Because we got to figure out what the rabbi actually said. This is a really common situation in rabbinic literature, and it all springs out of the nature of an oral tradition that really relies heavily on people being able to remember and repeat what they've heard. But specifically here, right, we're talking about the issue of remembering and repeating what we heard. So what's the issue here? He's in the Galilee, and they're asking him all these questions about the laws of Sukkah. He's able to answer some of the questions, but in some of the questions he's not able to answer because he never heard a tradition. So what's the issue? What's going on here in this story?
It sounds to me like he wants to honor his teachers and not be presumptuous and make any declarations on his own.
Yeah, the people in the Galilee community are upset with him because he's only willing to teach something that he heard from his teachers. He's not willing to give them an opinion based on his own knowledge and understanding that isn't backed up by a tradition, a shmuah, something that he heard. He responds to them with a certain amount of indignance and says, how dare you, basically, how dare you ask me to give you a halakhic opinion that's not based on what I heard? He talks about how he has spent all of this time in the Beit Midrash, and he was not idle, he was not sleeping, right? He has learned many things, but he's absolutely resistant to the idea of giving an opinion on something related to the halakha that he doesn't have a received tradition for. Dan, I can't hear you. I think you may be muted.
Thanks. I remember hearing in an argument, in an article about philosophy, that until recently, the general theory.
No, I'm unmuted. Yeah.
I'm
What?
sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Please go ahead, Dan.
The general theory of the world was that the world is degenerating as time goes on.
Mhm.
That it started out highest and is getting lower, and that changed around Darwin's time. But this seems to fit that perfectly, that every generation of scholars is a little bit less competent than the generation before it.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. That would, I think, characterize Rabbi Eliezer's attitude very well. And I think that's part of why I'm characterizing him here as a conservative figure, right? That idea that the past was inevitably better than the present is maybe kind of the definition of what we mean when we say conservative, right? This is very much Rabbi Eliezer's kind of approach, the way that he thinks. We can see even more evidence of this from other quotes that I didn't necessarily bring for this class, but there are other quotes from Rabbi Eliezer in which he complains that in previous generations, the standard of scholarship was considerably higher than it is in his day. He talks about how, in the past, since the destruction of the temple, right, all the rabbis now are like scribes, and all the scribes are basically like, lay people, and all the lay people are like ignoramuses, right? Like everybody's basically moved a step down the ladder in terms of their general knowledge and understanding of Torah. So I think Rabbi Eliezer would really agree with that perspective, where it's like the past is inevitably better than the present.
I would think maybe every longtime teacher would say the same thing today.
Maybe, I don't know.
What's the matter with kids today?
Kids, yeah, there's another perspective though, right? Which is the idea that over time, our knowledge tends to increase because each generation is building off the knowledge and understanding of the previous generation. And lest we think that perspective was completely absent among the rabbis, there's all kinds of cases in which we find that the rabbis of the Tannaitic period were willing and in fact eager to use principles of logical inference and biblical hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, in order to extend the laws of the Torah to figure out what the halachah would be about something that they hadn't received a previous tradition from. And this brings us to a key point that I think I want to emphasize here that's maybe significant for thinking about Rabbi Eliezer and also about early rabbinic Judaism in general. I've talked before about the concept of oral Torah, the Torah shebe'al peh, that's absolutely central to rabbinic Judaism. But here's the thing. The concept of oral Torah actually papers over a really important distinction that the rabbis acknowledge implicitly, but they don't necessarily want to point out or to really like accept, to publicize, right? And the distinction here is between halachah that's derived from received tradition, the thing that I know because I heard it from my teacher, and halachah that's derived from a process of midrash, right? Of using logical inference and textual interpretation in order to derive halachah by interpretation from the text. Both of those things are referred to by the rabbis under the same heading. They are both oral Torah. And the rabbis sometimes seem to operate as if both of those things, both the things that they learn from their teachers and the completely new innovations that they keep coming up with based on logical inference, are both Torah miSinai, that they are both ultimately Torah that comes down all the way from Moses at Sinai. I think on some level that the early rabbis were perfectly aware that in fact, right, at least the second kind, the kind that comes from logical inference, the kind that I just came up with because I'm a very clever person, right, that sort of oral Torah, could not possibly have actually come from Moses at Sinai in a historical sense. Nevertheless, they maintain that ultimately all of this stuff is oral Torah. And by using the same term to refer to both kinds of Torah, the stuff that we received as a genuine tradition from our teachers, and the stuff that we made up on our own with our very important cleverness, right? That by calling both of those things by the same terms, the rabbis are essentially papering over a key distinction that they don't want to draw too much attention to. And here's a suggestion for why this might be. If we go all the way back to Hillel and Shammai and their schools that were mutually antagonistic, well, there's some things that we can notice. Beit Shammai is generally regarded as being the conservative figure, right? Shammai was seen as a conservative figure. He did not like innovation. He tended to be the more strict in terms of his interpretations. He's generally seen as a conservative figure in the rabbinic tradition. Meanwhile, Hillel was seen to be the originator, or at least the codifier, of the principles of rabbinic hermeneutics. There exists a list of accepted principles according to which the rabbis could interpret the Torah in order to derive new halachot from. Hillel is understood to be the originator of that formulation of rabbinic hermeneutics. So if we want to look at it in a certain way, we can see this debate, this issue of received tradition versus logical inference as a continuation of the old Hillel and Shammai split. And from that perspective, Rabbi Meir appears as kind of an aficionado of the Shammai school, as opposed to the Hillel school that was much more interested in deriving new halachot from a process of biblical interpretation. The sages of the Tannaitic period do their absolute best not to call any attention to that distinction, lumping all of it under the general heading of oral Torah and saying it ultimately all comes from Sinai. And I think that this may actually be intentional to some extent. There may here be a tacit acknowledgement of a problem at the heart of the rabbinic enterprise, which is this. Rabbinic authority, right, the status of the rabbis, rests on their claims to the antiquity of the oral tradition. The whole reason the rabbis have a claim to be respected by their fellow Jews is this idea that they are preserving a genuine tradition from Moses at Sinai. That's where their authority comes from. But at the same time, the power and the flexibility of the rabbinic approach to Judaism depends on their ability to adapt the halachah to new circumstances through interpretation and analogy. And so they end up lumping both of those things, the genuine received traditions and their own innovations, together under the same heading in order to reconcile that basic disconnect between the source of their authority on the one hand and the actual power and value and usefulness of their approach to Judaism on the other. They are constantly trying to be simultaneously a conservative force that is preserving Judaism, while at the same time being an innovative force that is adapting Judaism to radically changed circumstances. And I think that on some level, the rabbis as a community understood that divide, right, or that dilemma, at least implicitly. And they try to paper it over with terms like the oral Torah that try to reconcile these very different ways of knowing. And I think Rabbi Eliezer is interesting in this regard in that he sort of represents one side of that debate, right? He's much more in favor of sticking to received tradition and is generally resistant to using logical inference in order to kind of expand that tradition beyond what the ancient sages may have passed down. Craig and then Sharon.
So, for instance, the laws of kashrut, that's midrashim or oral tradition or a combination, or how would you understand that?
So I would say that it's a combination. And in fact, I would say that the distinction between received tradition and midrash interpretation is actually a really tricky distinction to make. It's hard to pick those things apart. And the reason for that is this. There's certain branches of early rabbinic literature that express themselves primarily in the form of, this is the received tradition that we received from earlier rabbis. The Mishnah is phrased generally in pretty much that way. So if you go to the Mishnah, you'll find a whole lot of statements about this is the law without any indication of why it should be the law, right? It's being presented as, this is the oral Torah that we heard from our teachers and them from their teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that same period of early rabbi, those same group of Tannaim, also generated a different genre of literature called halachic midrash. You can find there are important collections of halachic midrash that basically that are written in such a way that they're deriving halachah through careful interpretation and hermeneutic kind of extrapolation from the text. And interestingly, a lot of the things that are presented in a lot of the same halachot that are presented in the Mishnah as this is received tradition, those exact same halachot are presented in the collections of halachic midrash in the mode of, this is the halachah because we're interpreting the text in this clever way. So I think actually any given halachah can be both. It just depends on how it's being presented in the piece of literature that you happen to be reading at the time. I think ultimately what that means, right, is that if we're wearing our historians' hats for the moment, the rabbis understand that their tradition, on some level, that their tradition is not really that old, right? The Pharisees didn't really exist prior to maybe a couple hundred years before the Common Era. Probably not even that early, not in that form at any rate. But they have a particular way of interpreting the Torah in order to derive a more detailed and comprehensive understanding of what the Torah actually demands of us. And they justify the insights of that process of interpretation by saying, ultimately, it's all handed down by, from Moses at Sinai. That ultimately, the distinction that I'm trying to draw here, and the distinction that we sometimes see in the rabbinic literature itself, is, at least I'm going to maybe raise the possibility that it's ultimately a fictional distinction, that it's all coming through a process of halachic midrash, through a process of interpretation, and that process itself is consciously obscured by the rabbis by attributing it all to an oral tradition that they claim has much greater antiquity than it actually does. Of course, by the time we get to the Tannaim, right, the generation of sages that are living immediately prior to and during and right after the destruction of the Second Temple, by that point, I mean, the claims are true. They genuinely do have traditions that were handed down from at least several generations of teachers. And so the claims of the oral tradition to be of some kind of antiquity are true by that point. But at the same time, I think it's sort of like this distinction is a tricky distinction because we can find the exact same halachah that is represented as an ancient oral tradition in one text, and in another text is being derived through a process of biblical hermeneutics from a Bible verse. Sharon.
I was thinking if Rabbi Eliezer was felt that he was conservative and was maintaining the past, I would think that he must have known in his heart of hearts, at least when they got to Yavna, that almost everything they had to deal with was new.
Mm-hmm.
And that you could do your best to connect it to the past, but you had to know that we're in a new place, we're doing everything differently.
No, and I think that's true. I think it points to a basic kind of, I don't know, this may be kind of a postmodern turn, but like, I think it's valid is that, some of these distinctions that we place so much importance on, like the distinction between conservative and progressive, for example, are actually like every conservative, if they really genuinely want to hang on to traditional values, inevitably hits a point where they have to adapt those ancient traditions to new conditions if it's really going to survive, right? So every conservative has to, at some point in their life, become an innovator, or else the thing that they're conserving will just like fall out of their hands like sand slipping through your fingers. But on the flip side, every progressive, no matter how much they claim that it's sort of like the past is terrible, we're going toward the future is going to be better, every progressive ultimately has some aspect of some kind of past tradition that they're hanging on to and preserving, right? Progressive movements could not survive as movements if they did not themselves have traditions and values that they're carrying and passing on to the next generation of progressives, right? So every conservative is also an innovator. Every innovator also has something that they're conserving. And these distinctions that we make are not nearly so absolute, I think, as we sometimes like to pretend that they are. I think Rabbi Meir, there's maybe some indication to suggest that he was, in some respects, kind of conflicted and a little bit in, and maybe not, and for want of a better term, a little grouchy about the whole thing as a result, right? Which actually brings us to a different point, which is, we mentioned this last week when talking about Rabban Gamliel, this famous incident of the oven of Achnai, in which Rabbi Eliezer holds to a halakhic position regarding the purity of a weird hypothetical form of oven that he thinks is pure and the entire rest of the rabbinic community thinks is impure. And as punishment for his continuing to insist on upholding his minority position in the face of the majority, he is excommunicated by the Sanhedrin as headed up by Rabban Gamliel. So if you want the full story of that, we talked about it in a little bit more detail last week. But what I actually want to hold up this week is the sort of epilogue to that story, which is this. Rabbi Eliezer is excommunicated from the rabbinic community that he helped to found. And you might think, oh, well, eventually they'll see reason and let him back into the community. The answer to that is they did not. His ostracism persisted to the very day that he died. Even as his fellow sages recognized that this was a problem because the Torah that he had mastered was so invaluable because he was such a cistern that kept all the water, right? Like they recognized his importance while at the same time feeling bound to uphold his excommunication for the purposes of maintaining the standards and laws of the rabbinic community. All of this ultimately comes to a very sad conclusion, very, I think, kind of poignant conclusion at the very end of his life. And that's kind of the text that I want to maybe explore here as we kind of come toward the end of this class. So can I get someone else to volunteer to read who hasn't had a chance to read yet?
I'll read.
Cool. Who was that, Mickey? Okay, great. All right, I'm going to share screen here once again, and I'm going to scroll down here. Okay, so this one I'm actually taking from a secondary source. This is from a text called Who's Who in the Talmud. It's a book by Shulamis Freeman. This is an excellent book. I often kind of rate it for useful kind of stuff for this class, and highly recommend it to folks if you happen to have some money to throw at a new book. It's an excellent book for like the learning who is who in the Talmud. So we're looking at this one, Who's Who in the Talmud. This is from page 147. Take it away, Mickey.
Another Beresa relates the conversation Rabbi Eliezer had with the sages before he died. They sat at a distance of 4 cubits from him. He rebuked the scholars for withdrawing from him, lifted his arms and said, "Woe for my arms that are like 2 Torah scrolls and that are about to leave this world. If all the seas were ink and all the reeds quills and all the people scribes, they would not suffice to write all the scripture and Mishnah I learned and all that I was taught at the yeshiva. And my pupils have taken no more than the paintbrush takes from the palette." The sages asked him a number of halachic questions regarding ritual purity. He answered all the questions, and his soul departed with the world, tahor, pure. Rabbi Yehoshua arose and said, "The vow of excommunication is annulled. The vow is annulled." And he clung to him and kissed him and wept. "Rebbe, Rebbe." Rabbi Akiva rent his clothes and fell to the ground and cried out, "Woe is to me for you, Rebbe, for you have left the whole generation orphaned. I have many coins to exchange, but no one to accept them."
Thanks, Mickey. So, thoughts and reactions to that?
It reminds me of the posthumous traditions that we have today, where, I don't know, a person can be redeemed by writing a book, or you can give somebody a position or a raise. And seems to me that he was given, he wasn't excommunicated forever, just until the day he died, and then after that, he was no longer excommunicated.
Yeah.
And Lucas would like to add what he added. Row, row, row.
Sounds like a very good doggy. Yeah, I think there's something very poignant about this story because it indicates, some of the really difficult moments that can arise when group dynamics and the imperatives of a system of law and authority come up against the very genuine and real emotional attachments and connections that can form between members of a community. And I think this period, we explored this a little bit last week with Rabban Gamliel, but I think here in the life of Rabbi Eliezer in particular as well, right? We need to remember that this community did not just come into the world fully formed, right? It's not just an accumulation of teachings that just sort of popped into the world. These are people, messy, uncomfortable, difficult, sometimes beautiful, wonderful people who had a great deal of difficulty sometimes figuring out how to live in community with one another, even while preserving at the same time the understanding that this community that they were forming in the ashes of a destroyed civilization was absolutely essential and necessary to them as people and to the future of the Jewish world.
What I don't understand is why excommunication was necessary, because we'd already seen evidence that they were preserving the minority opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that really could have been the approach that they adopted here. And, they could have said, the halachah goes to everyone else, but this was his minority opinion about that theoretical oven. It seems really unnecessary. And I'm not sure that it was any comfort. It couldn't have been a comfort to be released of his excommunication after his death. It was meaningless for him, and it really was just to make all of them feel better about it.
I mean, maybe. I mean, if you accept rabbinic teachings about life after death, it may not have been meaningless to him. But in any event,
Okay.
there's a sort of tragedy to it, absolutely, from Rabbi Eliezer's perspective.
Mhm.
And that comes across very clearly in this story. Yeah, I think the answer to that is complex, and it has to do with the politics of this community, right? Because part of the reason, I think, for the friction in the Oven of Achnai story precisely is that these rules, according to which the rabbinic community is going to operate, have not been fully established firmly and for all time at that particular point in history, right? What we're seeing is different people, very strong-willed, sometimes with very passionately opposed opinions about how this community ought to operate. And in fact, right, Rabbi Eliezer represents a completely alternate take on how the rabbinic community should have operated, right? One way of looking at this conflict is this way, that Rabban Gamliel, in enforcing the vow of excommunication, was pushing for this concept of majority rule as the rabbinic decision-making process. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer was arguing for a completely different approach to rabbinic decision-making. His position was majority rule, what are you talking about? If we've got a tradition from our teachers, then that is the law. If we don't have a tradition from our teachers, we have no right to declare what the law is. That's his position, right? And that's a position that's fundamentally opposed to the position of the other rabbis who endorsed this notion of majority rule and kind of essentially a democratic form of decision-making, at least among the rabbis, right? So what we're seeing here is a conflict that is occurring, kind of a very polite civil war that is occurring within this tiny community to determine how it is, what are the rules and principles according to which this community is going to be moving forward, right? So it may seem to us like an unnecessary conflict, but I think to them it had more weight precisely because it had not yet been finally settled what form this rabbinic community was going to take or how it was going to operate in the future.
Right.
Yes, Joe.
Judy
No,
has
I
something.
was just thinking about the story that you said about what happened to Rabbi Eliezer when he was dying, because there is such a thing as a deathbed confession.
Mhm.
Now, and then forgiveness when you make that deathbed confession. Rabbi Eliezer was not doing that. He was just talking about all of his knowledge. The actual deathbed confession comes from all the rabbis around him.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones who needed the redemption because they realized at that time of death that they were the ones that needed to be forgiven for what they did to Rabbi Eliezer.
Absolutely. Rabbi Eliezer does not recant his position. His deathbed speech basically amounts to, you all are idiots, I'm still right. And nevertheless, right, he's so important to these people. He's such a revered and honored teacher that they can't help but respond in the way that they do when he finally passes away, right? It's as with so many social things, right? It's complicated. It's intensely, messily complicated in ways that are deeply infused with conflict and anger, but also with tremendous love.
Right, what I was going to add to that, touch on a little bit, because he was such an important figure. I think the rabbis kind of painted themselves into a corner,
Mm-hmm.
right, when they excommunicated him, because and like you said, they, if they're going with majority rule, they didn't have much choice because he brought all the divine proofs that he was right, and finally the rabbi, they stood up and said, the Torah is not in heaven, the Torah is with us. You gave it to us to handle. But it's like they knew he was right, but we're still saying something else.
Yeah.
They kind of painted themselves into a corner.
No.
And if I remember correctly, he still established his own yeshiva. Basically, he still was teaching. And the reason why I'm bringing this up because I want to compare him to Eliezer ben Avuya, the Acher,
Yeah.
who's mentioned, right? But you don't hear a lot of teachings, right, about him. Everything you hear about Acher really comes from Rabbi Meir,
Yeah,
right, who was his student, right? But Rabbi Eliezer is mentioned over and over and over and over again in the Talmud.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can bet that we're going to eventually get to Acher, and that'll be an interesting one in of itself. Okay, Sharon, real quick, and then I'm going to take us to one last thing before we finish up.
It's Dan.
Okay, Dan.
And I think Craig had something too. Oh, I was just thinking that Rabbi Eliezer is really harking back to prophecy. That there was a time when the Torah was in heaven, and it was communicated through people who said, I heard the voice of God. And Rabban Gamliel was essentially trying to outlaw that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is an important illustration of the ways in which, right, all of these positions ultimately have some justification because the Jewish people has evolved over time, right? We've changed very much throughout our history. And there's all sorts of cases where, a perspective or a way of doing things that made perfect sense to people at one particular point in history ends up making no sense to people later on. And there are times when there's disagreements about what way to go forward makes sense, right? In a way, there's a lot that we can derive from the history of the early rabbinic community in the Tannaitic period that is deeply relevant to our situation as Jews living in the multi-denominational period of modern Jewry, right? In which we actually have multiple different competing strains of Judaism, sometimes with very radically different approaches to answering the question of what is Torah or what is God, right? What's really interesting is the ways in which the example presented by the Tannaitic sages applies sometimes and sometimes does not apply to our situation as contemporary Jews. All right, I want to finish up here with one additional piece of text concerning Rabbi Eliezer. That's not so much about these big weighty matters, but just sort of a simple piece of Torah that he shared that I find kind of interesting. So I'm going to share this last little bit with us here, and then we can have any last questions or comments and finish up. So this is from another one from the Talmud. This is from Masechet Sota 48b. So it's quoting a passage from Mishnah Sota. And from the time when the second temple was destroyed, men of faith ceased. Rabbi Yitzchak says, these are people who believe in the Holy Blessed One, as it is taught in a Baraita. Rabbi Eliezer the Great, that's our Rabbi Eliezer today, says that whoever has bread in his basket and says, what shall I eat tomorrow? He is nothing but a person of little faith. Which I think maybe expresses something different about him in terms of his personality. The idea of, that sometimes it's maybe important not to worry so much about the future. Sometimes it's maybe important to try our best to have faith that things will ultimately be taken care of, and to focus on the basket of bread that we have in front of us. All right, opening it up for any last questions or comments that anyone has, especially folks that haven't had a chance to speak yet. But yeah, anything that people have before we finish up tonight.
I keep thinking about the zealots at Masada, and of course they were political extremists who didn't want anything to do with Rome and were willing to commit suicide as a result of it. And I'm thinking of the rabbinic interpretations and pronouncements that were disagreed by other members of the Jewish community, even though they weren't suicidal. Were they also not zealots in their own way, perhaps? Yeah.
I mean, the rabbis certainly have a very forceful set of opinions about the way in which Judaism ought to operate. They were not the only group in in this period of time, immediately before the Common Era and immediately after right into the Common Era, that had strong opinions and maybe different opinions about the way in which the Jewish people should go. Historically, it's difficult to conjure up what it must have actually been like to live as a Jew at that period in history, right? Because we come to it from with a huge pile of history, right, separating us from them, right? The main reason, right, or at least one of the main reasons why we look back at this particular group, at the rabbis, with so much respect, is ultimately their approach to Judaism stuck. They were able to make a persuasive enough case to the rest of the Jewish population at that time for their approach to Judaism in the wake of the Second Temple's destruction, that people who identify as Jews in the present day, outside of a very small minority, are operating within the rabbinic or at least post-rabbinic stream, right? But that does not mean that there were not a whole bunch of other also rans back at the same time. The issue, right, the real issue historically is that of those groups who were not the rabbinic Jews, they generally ended up succumbing to one of two fates, characterized on the one hand by the zealots and their friends, the Tzaddokim, the Sadducees, who also generally were involved in the rebellion. They were wiped out by the Romans, right? Their rebellion ultimately could not succeed, and they were killed after murdering a whole bunch of their fellow Jews in the process. The other side of that, right, of course, is the Christians, who were another also ran among the Jewish people, at least in their early phases. But of course, they also end up being also rans when it comes to specifically Jewish history, because they ultimately end up defining themselves completely outside of the realm of Judaism and start a new religion, right? That, okay, still survives today and to a very great degree and has had a tremendous impact on world history, right? But not really specifically Jewish, right? The rabbis are so significant because their approach ultimately ends up paving the way toward the preservation of something that is recognizably Jewish and not something else, that has the ability to survive in a difficult, complicated, and sometimes extremely anti-Semitic world, right? And I think despite all of that, right, there's still a lot of room to criticize various aspects of the way that the early rabbinic community operated, right? Rabbi Eliezer is no saint, at least not from my perspective. His adherence to tradition at the expense of hermeneutics is, from my perspective as a Reconstructionist rabbi, the exact opposite direction to go. I tend to be more sympathetic in this regard with the Hillelite side that tends to focus heavily on our right to interpret the Torah and create new ideas of new Torah ideas. But even aside from that, right, Eliezer's conservatism ended up translating into some fairly unpleasant attitude, for example, toward women, right? Rabbi Eliezer is known as being in the debate that existed among the rabbis at the time about whether women should be able to learn Torah. Rabbi Eliezer was the one who argued very forcefully against teaching women Torah. And ultimately his position prevailed. and represented more or less the norm within Judaism for many, many, many centuries until relatively recently, right? So, yeah, for all that, you've got to respect these rabbis for the contributions they made to the preservation and development of the Jewish people. You know, I think there's also a lot of room for criticism as well, certainly. All right, folks, we are getting to very near the hour-and-a-half mark, so I feel like we really ought to finish it up there. Thanks everyone for being here with us tonight. And as usual, I will be uploading this onto YouTube, so people can share it out to folks who did not get a chance to attend.